Uh, our second story of the month is around an announcement from Historic England. Sorry, and this is their new plan to address England's Archaeology Archives challenge. And this is actually a challenge that we have touched on in previous watching briefs a few times now, I think, is the reality, even if we've really talked about it tangentially, the reality that, that to be blunt, archives are running out of space. Archive staff are often...
Where they exist at all.
Where they exist at all. Archive staff are often overwhelmed, and therefore archives go they're not completely catalogued and therefore understood, and this has other knock-on side effects. So I think we've mentioned this in the context of the discussion surrounding, for example, metal detectorists and this kind of thing, which we'll be coming to in a moment as well, in this watching brief, or this month's one. So that the arguments around, well, you know, there's no room, you can't have everything that comes out of the ground, all this sort of stuff. So it's quite a hot topic for archaeologists who care about the ultimate destination of artifacts and material, and frankly also access to that material for purposes of study. This is the so-called Mendoza Review, and a letter was put out, or rather so, was signed rather so, by Michael Ellis MP, who is the Minister for Arts, Heritage and Tourism.
Heritage and Culture.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. At the DCMS.
Exactly. And he has said that he's essentially pleased to accept all recommendations, and that from here on the DCMS will be include Historic England into development of Mendoza Review Action Plan. Now,
not that I'm cynical or anything, but do you know why the government can accept all the recommendations?
Why is that?
Because they don't involve spending any money.
Exactly.
It's if you read the letter, if you read the comments, if you read Mendoza's recommendations, it's all about Historic England and the Arts Council and other bodies getting together to discuss a sustainable future for archaeological archives. It's not a recommendation for archaeological archives.
Requests.
It's a recommendation to discuss archaeological archives.
Yeah. And also there's lots of sort of very soft words like request that the Law Commission do this, agree and welcome guidance, welcome the guidance, welcome and endorse the action plan. Okay.
If you look at it, the key to this for me is, I use the jargon DCMS just now, it's Department for Culture, Media, Sport. In fact, nowadays it's Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which gives you an idea where its priorities actually lie at the moment. It's a relatively small department in government. It has a very small budget, and it's primarily involved in the digital projects at the moment, and particularly the relationship with the EU in terms of data transfer and so on after Brexit, should it happen. So they have, in the Whitehall jargon, the work streams are primarily aimed at a post Brexit digital world, and they haven't got much headroom for anything else.
Well, also actually, it's arguable that, for example, in a World Cup year, having just come off Winter Olympics, that they also have an awful lot to do with the way in which sport is funded and how that affects Britain's international image.
That's right. And the thing that leapt out at me reading the recommendations and then the reaction to the recommendations, it's that the biggest problem curating archaeology, as with anything else to do with archaeology or anything else probably in our modern lives, is the money to do it. And what we're talking about primarily here are the archives of archaeological artifacts and data that are collected by the big contracting units like Mola and Wessex and all the others, who do contract developer funded work. And what the paper talks about is basically finding ways to pay for archiving through the developer funded system. The fact that they're having to say that we need to find ways to fund the ongoing curation of archaeological archives that come about through developer-funded archaeology, nearly 30 years after PPG 16,
PPG 16.
It's one of the biggest failures of the archaeological sector in the UK. I think that there was no, and government actually, in the interaction with government, there's been no joined up thinking on this. There has been in a few areas. In London here, we're lucky we've got Mortimer Wheeler House, the London Archaeological Archive and Resource Centre, which Mola started many years ago now, and it's a huge warehouse storage site where material can be properly collected, curated. It's made available to researchers. There are public rooms where they hold lectures and things like that. And the argument was there should be one of those in every region, every county.
Well,
but
of course, obviously we're burning through the anagrams here. So MOLA,
Museum of London Archaeology.
Yeah, and PPG 16 is a piece of legislation designed to...
Well, Policy Planning Guidelines 16, or Guidance 16, came out in the mid-1980s as a reaction to the disaster, really, that embarrassed everybody, which was the discovery of Shakespeare's Rose Theatre in London, which came on top of a number of other sites. But the Rose Theatre is the one that's most often cited. And basically, what you had there was an internationally important site that cropped up on a development site where they were going to build an office block that was going to be destroyed. And people said, basically, you can't destroy the theatre where Shakespeare premiered some of his most famous plays.
No.
There was an almighty row about it. There was a fudged solution whereby it's preserved in the basement of the building. And the idea behind PPG 16 was that if a developer wants to develop a site, they do archaeology beforehand at various levels, and everything can be properly discussed, and there's a proper chain of evidence and discussion and solution.
Well, and then crucially, what you have is an assessment by archaeologists and other experts as to the archaeological value of the site, whether or not that site should be, for example, protected, or whether actually it's okay for it simply to be observed and then destroyed. It's not all about just protecting everything. Well,
that's where the watching brief comes from.
Exactly, yeah.
It really became famous as part of PPG 16, which PPG 16 has now been superseded by what's called the National Planning Policy Framework. But the same principles are embodied in it, and the core principle. And again, it's why the Brexit argument is so important, because one of the key principles in the National Planning Policy Framework that was in PPG 16, and that modern archaeology lives on literally, is the principle that's embodied in EU legislation, European Union legislation, and environmental guidelines, that the polluter pays. In other words, if a developer wants to develop a site that could damage archaeology, as part of their public responsibility, they have to pay for the archaeology to be done before they can build their housing estate or their office block.
Well, and therefore it is odd, is it not, that in, for example, this Mendoza report, we have the notion of, so for example, I'm looking at, let's see, it is 0.31.25.
This is one of those documents.
The national lottery funding, for example, should more actively encourage joint projects between museums of all kinds, etc., etc. So the idea that somehow this is a new idea, and as you say, that the advocating joined up thinking, and crucially thinking that no public money has to go into, beyond obviously the public buying lottery tickets, the fact that this is being presented as one has to wonder exactly how it's going to solve some of these issues. It doesn't seem to be particularly bothered in terms of the substance of, say, archiving and actually researching. It seems to be more interested in particular sort of bulk storage solutions and getting around some of those issues. And it's worthwhile saying, because we have a friend and colleague who watches these videos, who may be appearing on a future video in the not too distant future, who is probably screaming at his phone screen or computer screen at the moment, that we haven't touched on the fact that also there's no call here for essentially museums reform, because actually a big part of the archives, for example, my local big archive with the Great Museum of the North. Um, is material you'd be amazed that it's here. Material, for example, which has come from former colonies of the British Empire, often ends up in archives in the UK. It's not being studied because there's no local museums impetus to study it, and yet it's sort of sitting in boxes, going dusty, and but there's no stated appetite in documents like this to talk about, for example, repatriation. We may well be able to solve some of these issues by actually reassessing what it is that we're trying to keep in the first place. Now,
I think we'll come back.
Well, yeah, we will come back.
Forgive me interrupting you. I think this is broaching a really interesting subject, but I think we might be coming back to with one of our media picks later on in Watching Brief.
Yeah,
I mean, I take on board that point in particular. What I would say to people watching, maybe people who aren't familiar with the way that the UK system for museum archiving has come about. We have basically, there's been no central direction, no central guidance, and like many things in British public life, starting with our unwritten constitution, it's been made up as we go along.
Well, but also actually in the context of archaeology, archaeological practice, having come out of an origin of benign amateurism, sort of a gentlemanly sport almost. It's led to different regions of the UK having different best practice, different units having different cultures about how they go about, for example, the handling of human remains. Increasingly, that is being more and more homogenised as we have consensus and conferences and this kind of thing. But when it comes
below that level of the archaeological units who are providing this vast amount of data and artefacts, you have a museum system that essentially grew up in the Victorian period, often with local benefactors who often still give their names to the museums. You know, you still get Carnegie buildings. You get, I mean, Canterbury, where I grew up, the local museum was called the Beanie Institute after Dr. Beanie, who endowed it for the good of the city.
So it has its roots in the curio, in collections of curiosities in that sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so the archiving, the actual background mechanism really was about storage in order to eventually bring that stuff out for, in some cases, very private collections perhaps, but also for the public to go, interesting. So this is possibly from West Africa. Okay, back we go.
Give you an example, a practical example. Over 10 years ago now, I was doing some work at the what became the Greenwich Heritage Centre, and I was reboxing material from their archive to check whether check the catalogue entries, whether it had been catalogued at all, cataloguing stuff that hadn't been catalogued, and repacking with modern packing materials to protect it and make sure it was available. And one of the boxes I opened was. Well, if it had been open since the 1930s, I'd be surprised. But what it contained in southeast London, a stone's throw from massive industrial site of Woolwich Arsenal, and in a relatively working class area of the city of Greater London, it contained atticware from Greece. Why and how it got there, we don't know. We assume it was given to the Heritage Centre when it was the Plumstead Museum by somebody who come across it either as a collector or as a tourist, or
possibly someone on the ground
pays money, takes your choice. It hadn't been catalogued, it hadn't been studied. It was lovely pottery. And I would argue it should have been there because just because people live in a part of southeast London doesn't mean they shouldn't have access to Greek pottery. I mean, the worst case recently was when Northampton sold Sakemka, and from the museum they said basically it's an Egyptian statue. People in Northampton aren't interested in it. It's nothing to do with it. It's nothing to do with Northampton. Our local industry is boot and shoe making. And that's what we want to concentrate our collections on, things that are relevant to the town. I think that is so short-sighted, because what that says is that our people don't deserve access to world-class, internationally important works of art and culture because we've made the decision they're not interested in it. Instead of you mentioned the Cabinet of Curios. The point about the Cabinet of Curios was people were curious, people were interested. You showed them objects, and it fired their imaginations or gave them a sense of awe or wonder or shock or horror. If it was some of the but it was a human interaction with these artifacts. But one of the problems, I think, to get back to the Mendoza review and the responses to it, I'm just looking at the couple of the comments, and I think these will sum up where we actually are on this and how it's not going to go anywhere fast. The two principal organisations are involved in this in terms of directing responses in Britain are Historic England on the heritage side and the Arts Council on the museum side. Duncan Wilson, Chief Executive of Historic England, his official comment on this: finding a sustainable future for these archives, which hold evidence of our everyday past as well as unique national treasures, is vital. We believe that the government endorsement sends a strong signal to the sector to work together to meet this challenge. And Darren Henley, Chief Executive of Arts Council England: we're delighted to be working alongside Historic England to seek a more sustainable future for archaeological archives. The sector-wide action plan will enable us to make positive progress on this long-standing challenge. That is officialese for we're kicking the can down the road.
It's vapid.
Yeah.
It's also easy to say.
Yeah.
I think you're right, and I mean, obviously we'll put links to these documents below. They are publicly available PDFs. Summary and recommendations. Point 1.1. 1.1.1 in this document sets out one of the key, or in fact the key goal really of this whole review, is to work with key stakeholders to produce recommendations for Departments for Culture, Media and Sport early in 2018, which will improve the long-term sustainability and archaeological, and they say, of the archaeological archives generated by developer-funded excavations. And there's nothing else that I really see in this document that really actually looks at what does that, from my perspective, what is the function, the purpose of an archive beyond storage, if you see what I mean. And for example, the statement that was put out that you read there talked about daily history and this kind of thing, access to that sort of material. Yeah. But provision for long-term sustainability of an archive is not the same as having a well catalogued, accessible, accountable archive. It's simply getting more shelf space and adequate environmental protections for delicate materials, as funded by developer-funded archaeology and also the Heritage Lottery Fund, or lottery monies. I would say it's not going far enough, and really this sort of thing needs and actually I think from within the sector as well, archivists, I think I've been to talks and lectures by local archivists who are crying out for proper provision, and also actually guidelines that they can apply wherever they go. So often they're fairly short-term jobs that archivists have, and they'll have to move from place to place, and when they go to a new council or a new authority or a new city or so, they have to often reinvent the wheel, because they're inheriting basically their predecessors' set of rules. So really this what we need is actually is an overhaul of the approach to archiving, the purpose of archiving, its relationship to the public, and in that sense also its accountability. But I don't think this sort of document will
I'd go slightly further than that, or maybe nuance it slightly differently. I think what we're needing here is a root and branch rethink of the provision of the responsibilities that come from the current way archaeology is done in this country. We've got if you look across the sector, and it's a pretty grim look. We've got problems with the historic environment records, where some councils don't even maintain them anymore because of cuts. We've got problems with developer-funded archaeology in that there are there's a draft of the National Planning Policy Framework revisions doing the rounds, which could, in some people's eyes, make lessen the protection for heritage and environment within the NPPF. Things that were paragraphs are now footnotes. We've got the issue of the health of the sector in terms of jobs and careers, which is fed in, the issues around higher education. We've lost the A-level. Recruiting in archaeological departments, anecdotally at least, is falling.
Working for those departments is becoming more and more stressful, with more and more unpaid elements to the job, including, for example,
absolutely.
Care.
And then if we add on top of that, even when the archaeology is done, the issues around archiving that this particular report and recommendations highlight, we've got a sector that is really staggering from one, I won't say crisis, but certainly one serious issue to another, often in parallel. It's almost like a patient with multiple complex health needs.
Yeah. Just imagining one of those old Acme iron lungs, like from a Looney Tunes cartoon. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's where I it's one of my hobby horses, but I think we shouldn't think of, we're just doing this for ourselves. It's not about a short-term fix. The British Museum was set up to be, whatever you think about issues around the Parthenon stroke, the Elgin marbles and so on. The museum was set up to be that cabinet of curiosities for the world, available for people to go and see, and crucially, available for researchers to go and look and touch and work with. And if archives aren't just somewhere where you put the big brown boxes at the end of the excavation when you've done the post-ex. If those boxes don't come out again, for someone to look at and reassess what you've done, or compare what you've done to what somebody else has done, then what's the point?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't want this segment to go on too much longer, but I remember when I was a student, I had a summer placement, which was it was quite a good little position that I managed to wangle, whereby I was reassessing and recataloguing the archive for my home county, and that really introduced me very quickly to the notion that there is this sense somehow that material in archives is done. It's finished. The puzzle has been completed, and it's just put into a box and put away. And so I came across material, oddly enough, that that was sort of 40 years old, that people in the 60s had done a PhD on, and reading the notes that had been left entirely voluntarily, I might add. There was no need for them to leave these notes. They left them there simply for a love of this artifact, that someone else might come along and see it. Reading these notes, the theories, the ideas, the notions linked with them were entirely out of date, and our understanding therefore of this material was entirely out of date. I asked people further up in the archaeological unit for the county, well, the head archaeologist actually, about this, and they said, well, essentially they just don't have the resources. This is what, 2006. They didn't have resources then, when actually the economy was doing quite well, to even contemplate doing that stuff. Essentially, unless there's a private, in that instance, unless there was a private benefactor paying for the specific upkeep of that particular artifact. So usually, let's say you find an interesting stone tool on someone's land, then actually it is just in a box and it's forgotten about, and it's all part of the problem, and it's a problem that we need to return to.
Can I make one last point as well, and that is that although there are problems with county libraries now, and particularly in places like Northampton and where they cut hours and things like that, there's still a pretty good provision of county archives, paper archives, documentary archives across the country. And you go to the National Archive as well, which I do regularly, and again, there is a excellent provision for making those crucially important sometimes very obscure, but documents available to researchers, and not just professional researchers. You go to the National Archive or County Archive any of the day of the week, and it's full not just of professional researchers, archaeologists doing desktops, professional genealogists and so on. It's people, retired people researching their family history because they've now got time to.
Yeah.
Archaeology should be like that, but unfortunately, one of the byproducts of a necessary professionalisation, I would argue, has been the sense that this stuff has been put beyond the enthusiastic amateur, that their contribution in terms of research wouldn't be valued as much as somebody with a university PhD working for an archaeological unit or something like that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are where we are. Archaeology is a small sector anyway, and we've probably accidentally, but we've reduced the number of people who actually want to go into these places and look at this wonderful stuff that's there. And I think we have to change that too.
Yeah. Honestly, this is the last thing I'm going to say on this, and then on that, with that in mind, I think previous generations of archaeologists have tended to view themselves in that sense as gatekeepers as opposed to facilitators.
Yes.
I think there's an increasing movement within archaeology and, for example, archivists and related, lab researchers as well, to actually see themselves as facilitators and actually have a much more innovative approach to public access to what they're doing. Some of this is done, for example, on Twitter. Some of this will be done through actual physical access to archives. But I think the one thing that I would stop short of saying, though, and this is where I'm going to disappoint my this friend and colleague who will, it's going to be a surprise, we'll see him soon, is that I wouldn't tear the whole thing down. I don't think we need to destroy museums. I think museums have a place, but possibly now, with the various technologies that are available to us, the various ways that we can make this stuff available, the function of the museum needs to be beyond the curio, beyond the curiosity cabinet. And I think often because of budget, the person who's doing the front-facing county museum in a library or something simply has to go, okay, well, that Roman bathhouse, for example, in the case of Prestatyn, well, this is the stuff we found. Here's, broadly speaking, what we thought about it when, back in the 1980s when it was excavated. That'll do. And so there is a money element here, which this Mendoza review does actually touch on, but it's a sticking plaster when actually possibly what we need to do is break the bone and reset it, as opposed to actually.
It's not even a sticking plaster. It's we really ought to go to the supermarket and buy a packet of sticking plasters.
Yeah. And
then the argument is, which brand shall we buy?
Well, yeah, and then a minister saying, we promise to recommend to Mum that we go to the supermarket and get some sticking plasters. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think
to round this one up. We ought to wrap this one up. Really,
we've said enough. But I think actually this it all had to be said. So I think this has been a good little segment.
And also, please, anybody out there watching this who agrees, disagrees, whatever, please respond below the line, because I think one of the ways things are going to change is pressure from below as well as from above.
Yeah. Comment below, or actually email us. The email's up there above us. Yeah, there you go.
Yep.
Okay.